having a prominent Muslim leader, in this case Fethullah Gulen, who's Turkish, condemn terrorism without any qualifications, without any ambiguity, is, I think, a contribution to reducing the level of Islamophobia in the United States and the West. My name is Nader Hashemi. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the Josef Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. I'm also an associate professor of Middle East and Islamic politics, and I teach in the broad area of political theory, comparative politics, focusing on the contemporary Middle East. My views of the Hizmet movement are generally very positive. I have some criticisms of them, but on the whole, I'm very sympathetic to the work that they have been doing both inside Turkey and around the world. And so I have a generally very favorable and positive view of the Hizmet movement. I view Fethullah Gulen as one of the leading Muslim intellectuals and scholars of the contemporary period, and I actually wish that more people, both Muslim and non-Muslim, will become familiar with his ideas. He's very well known in Turkey. He's known in some intellectual circles in the West, but I think if his views were more widely distributed within the broader Muslim world, the Arab world, Iran, South Asia, Southeast Asia, I think his ideas, deserve to be studied and looked at and debated among Muslim communities and non-Muslim communities. So I view him as a very significant figure. Number one, I think one of the most important contributions as someone who studies democratic theory, processes of democracy in the Middle East, I think the role that the Hizmet movement has played in terms of Turkey's democratic transition away from military rule toward democracy, I think a lot of credit can be laid at the doorstep of the Hizmet movement. Just to cite one example, I think the 𝐊𝐴𝐷 conferences or the 𝐊𝐴𝐷 platforms that were sort of organized by the Hizmet movement played an important role in terms of reducing political tensions in Turkey, bringing people from different ideological perspectives together and trying to resolve and debate and discuss in a peaceful manner many very important and emotionally charged issues in Turkey. So internally, I think the Hizmet movement has played an important role in terms of facilitating the process of democracy. Secondly, on a global scale, I think the Hizmet movement and Fethullah Gulen have played an important role in terms of trying to present and advocate a more moderate and peaceful image of Islam. Islam in the West, particularly after 9/11, has a very bad image. I think when you read the works and the ideas of Fethullah Gulen, when you interact with people who are part of the Hizmet movement, you are exposed to, I think, an interpretation of Islam that is in keeping with the interpretation of Islam that many so-called moderate Muslims have. And so I think in those two areas, in terms of the image of Islam, in terms of the role that the Hizmet movement has played with respect to interfaith dialogue outside of Turkey and within Turkey in terms of the process of democratization. Those are the two issues that immediately come to mind that I would register as being significant contributions that the Hizmet movement has performed in our world today. Unfortunately, in the West, after 9/11, the one interpretation of Islam that most Americans, most Westerners are exposed to is a radical, violent, extremist version of Islam that has its roots in Wahhabi Islam and Al-Qaeda. So you read Fethullah Gulen's interpretation of Islam or the Hizmet movement's interpretation, it's completely opposite. It's like night and day. So in that sense, it's sort of exposed mostly Westerners and Muslims themselves to an interpretation of Islam that is both modern and authentically Islamic. It's one that can, I think, withstand and contribute to the challenges and the criticisms that go with living in a modern age. So I think in that particular area, providing an alternative to the radical, violent interpretation of Islam that dominates our news headlines, the Hizmet movement and Fethullah Gulen have played an important conversation in providing an alternative narrative interpretation of Islam. And so I think that in and of itself is a contribution. I mean, for example, Fethullah Gulen's specific condemnation of terrorism, I think for many Westerners and Americans who know nothing about Islam, and all they hear is what's coming out of the mouth of al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, to hear Fethullah Gulen explicitly condemn terrorism shocks many Americans, because for many Americans, unfortunately, there's still a lot of ignorance, a lot of prejudice, a lot of Islamophobia with respect to the country that we live in, the world that we live in. So having a prominent Muslim leader, in this case Fethullah Gulen, who's Turkish, condemn terrorism without any qualifications, without any ambiguity, is, I think, a contribution to reducing the level of Islamophobia in the United States and the West, and presenting an image of Islam, a face of Islam that's more moderate and more peaceful. And I think, credit has to be given where credit is due. And so I would also credit Fethullah Gulen in sort of speaking very principally on the question of terrorism. But that just reminds me of another, I think, important contribution of the Hizmet movement, and of Fethullah Gulen in particular. There's a strong theme, a strong commitment to nonviolence in the teachings and the writings of Fethullah Gulen and of the Hizmet movement. That in itself, I think, is a contribution. There's too much violence and justification for violence on religious grounds among different Muslim groups in the Middle East, and to have an alternative narrative that is trying to condemn that interpretation and provide an alternative interpretation of Islam that's rooted within Islam's own authentic religious heritage, in and of itself is, an important contribution, and it's an important task, and credit should be given to the Hizmet movement and to Fethullah Gulen for presenting that narrative. When I think about the Hizmet movement and I compare it to other social movements and groups within the Muslim world, the immediate sort of difference that I see is that the Hizmet movement has a strong emphasis in education and in engaging with the modern world, not running away from it. You read the teachings or the writings of Fethullah Gulen, you're immediately struck by a man who is a very pious and practicing Muslim, but he's a man of the modern world. He doesn't run away from it. He's engaged with ideas. He reads broadly in both Eastern, Western literature and politics and history and philosophy. So that's a big difference. Someone who is Muslim but is engaged with the modern world and who's involved in educational work. That's sort of immediately what comes to mind. And also I think one of the differences that I see in the Hizmet movement is a strong commitment to reaching out to other groups in the societies and in the world that we live in, people who are from different faith communities, and trying to have a dialogue and a conversation with them. In the different cities that I lived in North America, the different sort of local Hizmet groups or chapters have been very successful in reaching out to Christian groups, Jewish groups, other groups, and bringing them together to discuss issues of common concern. So I think those are some of the key differences. I think my reaction to what's happening in Turkey today and the accusations that have been leveled against the Hizmet movement by the Turkish government, particularly by the current prime minister, is that they are there's an attempt now by the Turkish government to not be accountable for the policies and the actions that he has been performing over the last several years, but really from the time that he was elected. And if you just think about the accusations that are being made, what's the accusation? What's the nature of the accusation that's being leveled by Prime Minister Erdogan at the Hizmet movement? That they've what? They're a parallel state? That's just an accusation. What in fact has been happening is that the Hizmet movement has been exposing government corruption. And if you are familiar with the process of democracy, democracies are successful to the extent that you can hold elected officials accountable, to the extent that the people who elected the politicians can be aware of what's happening behind closed doors. And so I think the Hizmet movement's exposure of government corruption, the concentration of power, the abuse of power, the attempt to silence criticism, I think those are positive things that I think are contributing to democracy. And the reason why Erdogan is critical of the Hizmet movement is because he doesn't want to be accountable to his own society. So there's a broader context here. I think Turkey has made a lot of important strides forward in the last 10 to 12 years, since the AK Party came to power in 2012. In many ways, it was a model for the Muslim world. Who talks about Turkey today as a model? And the reason why people don't talk about Turkey as a model is because, and exactly because of the authoritarian and thuggish policies and behavior of the current Turkish Prime Minister. So I think his reaction to the Hizmet movement is really a reaction that is motivated not by anything that the Hizmet movement has done that's illegal or immoral, but he doesn't want to answer for the policies that he's pursuing. So I think the accusations are unconvincing. I think they're mean-spirited, and I'm hoping that Turkish society can figure out a way to resolve this problem that they're currently experiencing. Because if they can, and I hope they can, I'm still very optimistic about Turkish democracy. Democracies always face difficult moments, crises. I think we're seeing that happening today in Turkey. And the challenge really is for all members of Turkish society to try and come together and try and resolve this nonviolently, peacefully. And one of the ways that you sort of, I think, advance a democratic project is you hold elected leaders accountable. Whenever there's concentrated political power, that's very dangerous. And I think that's exactly what is happening in Turkey today. You have a lot of power concentrated in the hands of one government, and you don't have sufficient accountability and exposure for the policies. So that to the extent that these policies can be exposed and the Turkish government can be forced to account for its policies, I think that's a positive step. And so I think, again, in this instant, the Hizmet movement is playing a positive role in contributing to Turkish democracy.